Right side of the room, thank you for coming to the left side. A lot of appreciation here today. So, everyone, first of all, thank the First Flight Society. Maybe you could all give yourself a round of applause. This was an incredible event. It's amazing to do this during the holiday and for taking out your time on the last weekend before Christmas during the season. So many of you heard earlier today, I assume many of you were outside catching pneumonia. So I think we all heard some of the story that I shared about General Davis. But one thing I wanted to do today was kind of give a little bit more color of kind of how he became an aviator and share a little bit of the family story, just to improve the context of it and maybe give some new insights on kind of, we always see the success at the end, but never really understand how it got there in the beginning. And then really leave you all with the message of each and every one of us has the opportunity to change the destiny for our own families. And sometimes it's the smallest investment in seed and topsoil that people need just to be inspired. So that's kind of the birth of this story. So I just kind of wanted to share that story of Ben and his father, who I refer to as the Invisible Generals. What I shared with you earlier is that in my own family, I was in my 30s before my dad ever shared any of the story with me. So Ben never talked about war, fighting. He lived in Arlington, Virginia, 1001 Wilson Boulevard, apartment 906. We would go there for everything. It was the center of our family. There wasn't one picture anywhere of any military. It was very feng shui. He had a great time in Asia, in Japan, and Taiwan, so it was a very Asian-themed apartment. But like I was saying earlier, I would have never really known what the man did in his career. So I think part of it is sometimes our families shield us from our own stories, and we don't even know that until I saw that movie, Red Tails. So I just want to share, this is actually Lewis Davis, which was Ben Davis Jr.'s grandfather. And I'm going to start the story with him. Ben Davis Sr., who was Ben's dad, Ben, and then my dad, who we raised from the time he was 6 years old, and then myself right there. My dad ended up becoming a judge for the state of Connecticut. He had really bad eyesight, but always wanted to be a pilot like Ben, but just unfortunately his eyesight was so bad. But I want to share the story, the beginning of our family story actually started with this guy here, Lewis Davis. And the story is going to spread a few hundred years, I'll go really fast. But he was actually born a servant and was hired by the Logan family. And if you, for the history majors in this room, you probably heard of Logan Circle or Square in Chicago and DC, Logan Airport in Boston, are named after a gentleman named General Logan. He was a general in the military as well as a congressman, and he actually hired Lewis Davis to be a servant as a child in his home. And he did so well at that job that he became Ulysses S. Grant's son's babysitter. And when Ulysses S. Grant had his second inauguration, there was 3 people in the buggy: Ulysses S. Grant, Lewis Davis, and Grant's son. So that was really the beginning of our family story. And Lewis was the only black that was freely allowed in and out of the White House at that time. And he got to meet so many different people that worked as elected officials, as politicians, as people in the military. And he ended up getting a job for the Department of the Interior. And he had, his oldest son was Ben Davis Sr. And what he had asked his son is, what do you want to do when you grow up? And his son said, I want to be a soldier. So Lewis asked General Logan to give him the 2 signatures to get into West Point Military Academy. And Logan signed the form so Ben Sr. could go to West Point. And when he submitted it, it landed on the desk of President McKinley. And the president said, we don't want to get into the habit of allowing blacks into West Point. And he rejected his application. Ben Sr. ran away, one-way train ticket to Wyoming, and he had heard about a group of black soldiers that was out there that was led by a a black who graduated from West Point, and that guy's name was Charles Young. And Ben Sr. Joined the Buffalo Soldiers as a young man in the volunteer army, and he learned how to be an equestrian horse rider because he felt that was the easiest and best way for him to get promoted. After doing that for 2 years, he was so good at it that they submitted his name to get promoted to second lieutenant, which would be equivalent of graduating from West Point. And President McKinley, as a favor to Lewis Davis, elevated him to the rank of officer. And at that time, he was one of only 2 black officers in the whole United States military, along with Charles Young. So if it wasn't for his dad, and that's the reason I tell you all this story, if it wasn't for his dad, he would never have been able to get that opportunity to be an officer. So, he's now an officer in the military. He has 3 children, and at the birth of his 3rd child, his wife dies in labor. And he becomes a single father. And his son, he had 1 son, Benjamin Davis Jr., who we're honoring here today, and he tells his dad, who's living in Washington, D.C., that you're gonna have to help me raise these kids as a single dad because I wanna keep them together, and I wanna make sure they can live out their dreams. So he brings Ben Jr. to go to see a barnstorming airplane, and Ben Jr. tells his dad he wants to be a pilot. So the only way that he could be a pilot that his dad saw was to get him into West Point. And the only way to get him into West Point is that you had to have 2 signatures. You had to have one from a congressman in your district, and you had to have one from an Army officer. There was 1 black Army officer in the entire military, and it was him. And there was 1 black congressman in the United States. So what does he do? He sells the family house that was his dad's in Washington, D.C., relocates the entire family to Springfield, Illinois, so he could live in the district, so he could be a resident of the district of the place to get the second signature. Wow. And this is how Ben Davis Jr. got the 2 signatures to get into West Point so he could become a pilot. So when we say people have to go through incredible journeys, I mean, this is like 2 full generations just to get your son into college, essentially, is what we're saying here. So he gets his signatures, he hugs Ben Jr. Ben Jr. takes a one-way train to West Point. He gets to West Point. He goes to the commandant's office, and under the sign that says duty, honor, country, they had pulled him in for a special meeting. They didn't know he was black. So they tell him he has to wait for his room assignment. He waits for his room assignment, and they put him in a converted janitor's closet because it was still segregated. So here he is, he's 18 years old, he's in college, he's at West Point Military Academy, living in a janitor's closet with no roommate. And he calls his dad and he goes, "Dad, this whole experience is just not really what I thought it was gonna be." And his dad said, "You know, you have to set your graduation goal and your target date. You know, there's 8 million people that are pulling for you." And Ben said to him, "It's unfortunate none of them are here." And that began Ben's journey at West Point. So it's important to understand what he went through in the training that his dad gave him to persevere. So for the course of 4 years, and you know, it was 52 weeks a year was West Point at that time. You got 1 week off in the summer and 1 week off during a holiday. He had nobody speak to him. So there was a meeting on his 3rd day where all the cadets got into a room and they said, "We accidentally let a black in here, and what we need to do is silence him until he drops out." So he ate alone at his own table. When he would go to sit, everybody would get up. He went to the Army-Navy game on his own bus that was segregated. He wasn't allowed to take boxing because no one would box with him. He never passed CPR because no one would, role play with him. And he was isolated for 4 years, 50 weeks a year, with not any human interaction. And when I went back to West Point 5 years ago, and we were talking about dedicating the barracks to him, no one could understand how anyone could pass. He was banned from the library because it was segregated. He couldn't be in a study group. And when all was said and done after the 4 years, he finishes in the top third of his class because that was the only way you could pick the assignment that you wanted. And if you heard the general say today, he was 35th out of a class of 276. Because he couldn't do CPR and boxing, those were 2 Fs. So if he would have been able to complete those classes, he actually would have been in the top 5. So he graduates from West Point. And this is actually his graduation photo, shaking the hand of General Pershing, who was the commander of World War I for the Allied forces in America. He was the superintendent at that time. And then he takes a photo with his dad, and this is on graduation day. So this photo here, they represented the only 2 black officers in the entire U.S. military. There was a father and a son. Wow. And because blacks couldn't be in charge of whites, and then whites would not salute blacks, the only assignment they could give them was go to black colleges and teach ROTC. So for the next 4.5 years, him and his dad get in the Jeep and go to each black college and teach them ROTC, Military War College. And he tells the guys, one day something's gonna happen. This can't be like this forever. One day something's gonna happen. He was less than 1 year before being too old to apply to be a pilot because you age out, and he'd already been out, graduated for 4 years, and World War II started. And that was the beginning of an incredible opportunity for him and his dad, because his dad was brought in by FDR because FDR wanted to win re-election and they couldn't get the black vote. So FDR says to Ben Davis Sr., how can we get the black vote? And he said the only way to get it is to make the military equal and to allow blacks to have the premium assignments, such as aviation. And he said, but if we do that, who would lead it? And he said, my son. And Ben Davis Jr. went to Tuskegee, and that was when they put out an announcement that they were going to allow blacks to be pilots in the United States Army Air Corps, thinking that no one would apply. But all the 4.5 years that they went to those black colleges, when they put out the ring, boom, over 15,000 people went down to Tuskegee, Alabama to sign up for the Army Air Corps program, and that was the creation and the foundation of the Tuskegee Airmen. Wow. So now they're all down in Tuskegee, and the president's still not sure what's going to happen here. So his wife goes down to let him know, and there's many different accounts of exactly. That's Chief Anderson there, who was really one of the original black training pilots, and with Eleanor Roosevelt. And there's different stories and accounts about what the Secret Service was doing and how everybody was like, what is she doing going up in this plane? But she flew, and then she came back to the base and called the president and said, if it's safe for me to fly with them, it's safe for them to fly in the United States. So this has actually been his first flight, so it's not as famous as the Wright brothers kite photo that we weren't sure the kid knew if he took it or not. But this is actually Ben's first solo flight that he took by himself there. So there's a couple of his guys that were rooting him on. And that was the beginning of really the Tuskegee Airmen, which became over 15,000 men and women. No one wanted Ben to be successful, so he didn't have anybody train him on how to command a group. So here he was in his late 20s, and he was commanding 15,000 people as a colonel in the middle of World War II. Once all the guys were trained, they sat for over a year because they still didn't want to put them into the war. And it was actually the summer of '43, so next year will be the 80th anniversary of the Red Tails. Now, there's also different accounts on why the tails were red. But as Ben would tell us in the family, One of the challenges was that the maps during World War II were segregated. So because there was only one airfield for black fighter pilots, they weren't on anybody else's map. So Ben was so paranoid that someone from the American Allied Forces was actually gonna attack a friendly base. He painted the tails red so people would know that they were part of the United States of America. And that was when, it was 4th of July weekend, 1943, when they got the P-51s. And that was the foundation and the creation of the red tails, as we kind of know them in modern storytelling today. There's Ben with his plane. He had put by request on his plane because of the request of, it was a double entendre, where it was the request of the president as well as the request of other bomber fighters that he would come and escort them to their World War II missions. He's looking smooth there, he's looking smooth. We did cut out the cigarette in case there was any kids in the room, but it was a heavy smoke, we'll just throw that out there. So after that, Ben Sr. becomes the first black general in the United States Army, and Ben goes on to command the 13th Air Forces. He becomes a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star general. And this is actually a really interesting picture that we have in our home. But it was 1967, Lyndon Baines Johnson was the president, and he was told that he was going to be elevated to 4th star. And the night before he was elevated, they called him and they said that Lyndon Baines Johnson didn't feel comfortable allowing a black to be a 4-star general, and he had said he'd done enough for civil rights, so they had forced Ben to retire from the military in 1970, never ever getting the opportunity to be a 4-star general. Ben could not get a job in aviation because it was still segregated. So here he is doing all these different things. He couldn't get a job as a commercial pilot, a FedEx pilot. He couldn't get a job anywhere in any aviation. So the United States, the Pentagon created a new position called Secretary of Aviation Transportation, which was something that they just kind of pulled out of the hat on a Tuesday. And they gave the job to Ben. And you can see here, he became the advisor for safety in aviation for Ford, for Carter, for Nixon, and he advised the presidents in the White House on things that they should do to make the country safer. This is actually him walking through a concept that he created called commercial airport security. That was an idea that no one thought would ever work. And he worked to develop these metal detectors so you could set these up at airports so people could fly and feel safe. There he is in the Oval Office after he led the creation of the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit to make sure that cars were idling and using the premium amount of gas. And then also some other things I spoke about earlier today, the Flying Thunderbirds to help with recruiting, the United States Air Marshal Program to make sure people weren't hijacking airplanes. So he really was really active in the space. And then in 1998, Bill Clinton, through the pressure of John McCain, retroactively made Ben America's first black 4-star general in the United States Air Force on December 9th, 1998. And there's Bill pinning the 4th star on him there. And the reason that this is so important is because without this, they couldn't really name anything after him, because he would never have been a full general. Now, I won't talk about how they didn't pay the family for the 60 years. You can email that to Pete Brown. Okay, that's good. So Ben Jr. passed away on the 4th of July, 2002 on America's birthday. And his last request was he had requested a black tombstone at Arlington. He was the first black tombstone at Arlington, and he had asked that he could have a black tombstone on a hill overlooking those in death that overlooked him in life. So you can go there and see it. It's really beautiful. It's a huge marble tombstone, and him and his wife are buried there. We never really heard much about it, and then in 2015 we got a phone call from West Point, who had recently announced that they were going to create a new barracks, and they created the Davis Barracks here and dedicated it to him. So it's the largest, most expensive barracks on the campus. There's General Castle, my dad and I, Simone, she was the Army Corps cadet leader at that time. And then in 2019, the Air Force Academy renamed the airfield, Davis Airfield, after his accomplishments. So we did the ribbon cutting there. And also the Air Force Academy painted the tails red of the training planes and the gliders. So now people that become cadets can learn to fly in a red tail plane with General Davis's name on it. So if you go there, they have 12 of the gliders with the red tails. And now West Point has a tradition every year where they take photos of the diverse graduates to show the strength in numbers. And I just want to share this last slide here. Between Ben Davis Jr. and Ben Davis Sr., they were the highest ranking black in the administration for 10 different presidents and helped advise them on policies regarding safety, aviation, and integration, because the strength of America lies in the differences and the diversity, not always the similarities. So I just wanted to share that to give you a little context of when we look at somebody in a photo, when we see someone's name, we may not really necessarily know what they did, but the same way we know the Wright brothers and we know Lindbergh and we know Howard Hughes, I just ask everybody in here, take the consideration and learn about Ben Davis, because he did as much for aviation as anyone could do in their lifetime. And as a relative, I just appreciate the opportunity to continue to tell the story and thank organizations like yourself for being him, having him in the consideration set to keep his legacy and name alive. So thank you so much for your time today.